I realized something was terribly wrong the instant I watched a little girl unlock my front door with a vacation rental code I had never given anyone. She smiled, hugged a stuffed bear against her chest, and ran into my cabin as if she had been invited there. Her parents followed behind carrying coolers, fishing poles, and suitcases onto the porch my late wife and I built together nearly 20 years earlier. I remained behind the wheel of my truck, staring at the scene without moving. For days earlier, I had driven almost 200 miles to help an old friend repair storm damage on his ranch. I expected to return to a quiet weekend by the lake. Instead, complete strangers were settling into the one place my family treasured more than any other. What unsettled me most was not that they were there. It was how comfortable they looked. Nobody glanced over a shoulder. Nobody hurried. Nobody behaved like someone trespassing. They looked exactly like families arriving for a vacation they had planned for months. I stepped out of my truck and walked toward the porch, reminding myself that anger rarely solves anything before the facts are known. A man about my age noticed me first and offered a friendly wave. "Beautiful place," he said with an easy smile. "We cannot believe we finally found an opening." Before I could answer, his wife entered another code into the keypad beside my front door. The lock flashed green. The deadbolt clicked open. She disappeared inside my cabin without the slightest hesitation. I felt my stomach tighten. Emily convinced me to install that electronic lock years earlier because she always believed a little extra security was worth the investment. Watching someone else open it so casually felt strangely personal. "Excuse me," I asked as calmly as I could. "Who gave you that access code?" The man looked genuinely confused. "Our host," he answered while pulling out his phone. "She sent it this morning through Airbnb." He turned the screen toward me, obviously expecting to clear up what he believed was a simple misunderstanding. Instead, the moment I saw the listing, every hope that this involved the wrong property disappeared. The photographs showed my cedar porch, my private dock, my stone fireplace, and the handcrafted dining table my father built more than 30 years earlier. There was even a picture of the porch swing Emily insisted belonged in exactly one corner because it gave us the perfect view of the sunset across the lake. Someone had not only entered my home, they had carefully photographed the memories my family spent decades creating. Then I looked at the name beneath the listing. Karen Whitmore. My heart sank. Everyone living near Pine Ridge Estates knew Karen. She had served as president of the Homeowners Association for years. She also had absolutely no ownership interest in my cabin. I continued scrolling. 63 five-star reviews. Nearly every weekend booked through the next several months. Holiday rates. Cleaning fees. Detailed house rules. Local restaurant recommendations. Professional photographs. This was not a fake advertisement someone created overnight. It looked like a successful vacation rental business that had been operating for quite some time. The father studied my expression before asking quietly, "Are you with the property management company?" I looked directly at him and slowly shook my head. "No," I replied. "I own this cabin." The smile disappeared from his face. His wife stepped back onto the porch holding 2 grocery bags. The children stopped talking. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Finally, the father looked back at his reservation confirmation. "That cannot be right," he said almost to himself. "She has dozens of reviews. We booked this place almost 3 months ago." 3 months. That single sentence told me this was never an isolated mistake. Someone had been renting my family's cabin for an entire season without my knowledge. I assured the family they had done nothing wrong because they had trusted a respected booking platform, and every confirmation they received appeared legitimate. As they quietly gathered near the fire pit, I opened the listing on my own phone. The deeper I looked, the worse it became. There were descriptions of rooms inside my home, recommendations for using my dock, photographs of heirlooms that had never been shared publicly, and glowing reviews thanking Karen for another unforgettable stay. Then one detail stopped me cold. A new reservation was scheduled to arrive the following evening, and beneath it Karen had posted a cheerful reply less than 10 minutes earlier. "I cannot wait to welcome you to my favorite place on the lake." She still believed she would be the one greeting the next guests. She had absolutely no idea I was already home. The families apologized several times, even though they had done absolutely nothing wrong. They had searched for a quiet lakeside vacation, paid through a trusted booking platform, packed their vehicles, and driven nearly 300 miles believing they had rented a legitimate cabin. They were not trespassers. They were customers who had been deceived just as completely as I had. I asked if they would wait outside for a few minutes while I tried to understand what had happened. The father agreed immediately. "If this really is your cabin," he said, "we want to help however we can." That single sentence told me everything I needed to know about the people standing on my porch. Honest people do not become dishonest simply because someone else has lied to them. While they gathered near the fire pit, I continued studying the Airbnb listing on my phone. The deeper I looked, the more carefully planned it appeared. The photographs were professionally composed. Morning sunlight reflected across my dock. The stone fireplace glowed with a welcoming fire. The cedar dining table my father built by hand had somehow become the centerpiece of a luxury vacation advertisement. Emily's flower garden was described as the perfect place to enjoy coffee while watching the sunrise over the lake. Reading those words felt strangely unsettling because they transformed deeply personal memories into polished marketing copy. Then I opened the reservation calendar. Nearly every weekend for the previous 4 months had already been booked. Holiday weekends carried premium pricing. There were cleaning fees, occupancy limits, cancellation policies, pet rules, and detailed check-in instructions written with remarkable confidence. According to the listing, the property was professionally managed by Pine Ridge Estates Community Hospitality Services. I had lived beside Pine Ridge Estates for years, and I knew no such company existed. Whoever built this operation had invented an entire business around property they never owned. I moved down to the reviews. Families praised peaceful mornings on the dock, evenings around the fire pit, and sunsets from the porch swing. One guest thanked Karen for recommending a local barbecue restaurant that happened to be my favorite place in town. Another complimented the thoughtful welcome basket waiting inside the kitchen. Every review described Karen as a gracious and attentive host. Then something caught my attention. A family thanked her for making Thanksgiving unforgettable. Another described spending Christmas beside the fireplace. I quietly opened my own calendar. During both holidays, I had been visiting relatives in Missouri. Karen had not stumbled onto an empty cabin by coincidence. She knew exactly when I would be away. That realization changed everything. This was not opportunistic. It was planned. The father walked over holding his phone. "Would it help if I forwarded every email she sent us?" he asked. "We kept everything." I smiled for the first time that afternoon. "Yes," I answered. "Please send me every message." Within minutes, my inbox filled with reservation confirmations, payment receipts, check-in instructions, and direct conversations with Karen. Her messages sounded warm, professional, and reassuring. She thanked guests for choosing Pine Ridge Estates, reminded them to respect neighboring property owners, suggested hiking trails around the lake, and even included instructions for using my fireplace, my dock, and my workshop. The workshop was labeled as private owner's storage. Those 3 words stayed with me. Owner's storage. Karen had actually written them while presenting herself as the owner. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and slowly looked around the property. Fresh tire tracks marked the gravel driveway. The grass around the fire pit had been worn down from repeated use. Someone had recently replaced the propane tank beside the grill. This had happened many times before. Most people would have climbed into their truck and driven straight to Karen's office demanding answers. For a brief moment, I considered doing exactly that. Then I remembered something my father repeated whenever emotions threatened to outrun common sense. "The loudest person rarely wins," he always said. "The person with the best records usually does." I walked into my study, pulled an old leather notebook from the desk drawer, wrote the date across the first blank page, and began documenting every fact I could verify. As I finished the first page, another Airbnb notification appeared on my phone. Karen had just accepted the reservation for the following weekend and replied publicly beneath it, thanking the guests for choosing our family cabin and promising to greet them personally when they arrived. She was no longer simply renting my property. She was rewriting my family's story, and she still had no idea that someone had finally started keeping records of every decision she made. After the families found rooms at a nearby lodge for the night, Cedar Hollow Cabin became quiet again. Normally, that silence was my favorite part of living by the lake. That evening, it felt different. Every room reminded me that someone had been treating my home like a business while I had no idea it was happening. I walked slowly through the cabin without moving a single object. Fresh towels had been folded neatly in the guest bedroom. A basket filled with local snacks sat on the kitchen counter beside a handwritten welcome card thanking visitors for choosing Pine Ridge Estates vacation rentals. I picked up the card carefully and turned it over. Printed on the back was a professionally designed company logo I had never seen before. Karen had not simply posted an online listing. She had built an entire brand around property she did not own. I slipped the card into a large evidence envelope before walking into the small office at the back of the cabin. Inside an old wooden cabinet sat the recording system connected to my exterior security cameras. Emily convinced me to install them years earlier after a nearby cabin experienced several break-ins during hunting season. At the time, I thought she was worrying too much. Looking back, I was grateful she had insisted. I opened the archive and began reviewing footage from the previous several months. Karen's dark gray sport utility vehicle appeared far more often than I expected. She usually arrived 1 or 2 days before new guests. Sometimes she came alone. More often, 2 assistants followed in another vehicle carrying groceries, clean linens, flowers, and storage bins filled with supplies. They unlocked my front door with complete confidence, cleaned every room, arranged furniture, replaced towels, and prepared the cabin exactly the way a professional vacation rental company would. Nobody behaved like they were trespassing because they genuinely believed they belonged there. I continued making notes in my leather notebook, recording dates, arrival times, vehicle descriptions, and every detail visible on the cameras. Then something unusual caught my attention. Karen never visited without carrying either a clipboard or a tablet computer. Every trip followed the same routine. She inspected the porch, walked the dock, photographed the living room, checked supplies, and marked items on a digital checklist before leaving. During one recording, she briefly turned the tablet toward one of her assistants while discussing something near the front steps. I paused the video and enlarged the image as much as possible. The screen was slightly blurred, but one heading remained readable: Property Asset Inspection. Directly beneath those words was my cabin's street address. I stared at the screen for several seconds before writing the timestamp into my notebook. Someone had officially added my home to an inventory system. I kept reviewing footage late into the evening. Every reservation followed exactly the same pattern. Karen arrived. The cabin was prepared. Guests checked in. Guests checked out. Karen returned to clean, restock, photograph the property again, and prepare for the next family. This was no longer beginning to look like a side business. It had become a carefully organized operation. Then another detail caught my attention. While reviewing Karen's public responses to guest reviews, I noticed she repeatedly thanked visitors for choosing our collection of premium lake properties. I stopped reading and went back through every response. The phrase appeared again and again. Our collection. I knew every privately owned cabin within 5 miles of mine, and none of my neighbors had ever mentioned a community rental program. Either Karen was exaggerating to make her listing appear more successful, or there were other owners who had no idea their properties were being represented the same way. That possibility concerned me even more than everything I had already discovered. Before I could think much further, another notification appeared from the smart lock application. Curious, I opened the complete access history. Thousands of entries appeared, each marked with an exact date and time. Most belonged to me. Then I noticed something I had completely forgotten. Nearly 2 years earlier, while repairing part of the dock, I created a temporary contractor code that should have expired automatically after 1 week. Instead, a failed software update after a power outage had left the code active without my knowledge. Karen had not forced her way into my cabin. She had discovered an old contractor code that never properly expired and quietly decided to treat that accident as permanent permission. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the room. Some people mistake opportunity for authority. Karen clearly believed that because a door opened, everything behind it somehow belonged to her. What she failed to understand was that every electronic entry, every security recording, every reservation confirmation, every guest review, every message she sent, and now even her own public claims about managing multiple properties had quietly documented her decisions one step at a time. She believed she had spent months building a successful vacation rental business. Without realizing it, she had also spent those same months creating one of the strongest evidence files I had ever seen. And if my suspicion about those other properties turned out to be true, my cabin might only be the beginning. Sleep came only in short stretches that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured families gathering around my fireplace, drinking coffee on my porch, and watching sunsets from the dock my father and I rebuilt together years earlier, all while believing someone else had welcomed them there. Before sunrise, I made a cup of black coffee and stepped onto the porch. A thin layer of mist drifted across the lake, softening the shoreline until everything looked exactly the way it had for decades. The cedar trees stood perfectly still. The dock reached quietly into the water. A pair of geese floated past without making much noise. From a distance, nothing about the cabin had changed. Only I knew how many strangers had unknowingly spent weekends inside those walls over the past several months. Standing there, I finally understood why discovering the Airbnb listing had affected me so deeply. It was never about the money Karen had collected. It was about something far more personal. She had quietly taken ownership of my family's story without ever earning the right to tell it. Cedar Hollow Cabin had never been an investment property. My parents started building it in the late 1970s after years of saving every extra dollar they could. My father worked long shifts at the paper mill during the week before driving to the property every Friday evening with a truck full of lumber. My mother painted every room herself because hiring professionals simply was not an option. As a teenager, I spent countless weekends hauling stones from the lakeshore while my father carefully built the fireplace one rock at a time. Every beam overhead, every floorboard beneath my feet, and every window overlooking the lake carried a memory connected to someone I loved. After my parents passed away, Emily gave the cabin an entirely different kind of life. She planted the wildflowers lining the front walk because she believed every home should welcome visitors before they even reached the front door. She chose the blue shutters because they reminded her of the lake on crisp autumn mornings. She insisted we hang the cedar porch swing in exactly one place because it offered the perfect view of the sunset. Even after cancer took her 8 years. Earlier, I never found the heart to change anything. Her quilt still rested across the living room sofa. Her handwritten recipe cards remained inside the same kitchen drawer. The rocking chair still faced the water because every time I thought about moving it, I could almost hear her telling me it already belonged exactly where it was. That was why Karen's listing felt so deeply personal. She had not simply rented an empty cabin. She had unknowingly invited strangers into moments that belonged to my family alone. Guests admired furniture my father built with his own hands. They complimented flowers Emily planted one quiet spring afternoon. They celebrated birthdays and anniversaries beside a fireplace representing years of sacrifice and hard work. None of those families intended any harm because none of them knew the truth. They believed the story Karen had carefully written for them. According to her listing, the cabin belonged to a professionally managed collection of premium lake properties operated by Pine Ridge Estates. That description bothered me more than it had the day before. I opened the listing again and reread every public response Karen had written beneath guest reviews. The same phrase appeared over and over. Our collection of premium lake properties. The words no longer sounded like harmless marketing. They sounded like a claim. If my cabin was being presented as part of a larger portfolio, then either Karen was exaggerating to attract more bookings, or someone else might be experiencing the same thing without realizing it. I made a note in my notebook to ask Clara about that possibility before taking another sip of coffee. Then I remembered something my father used to say whenever neighbors argued over property lines. He would tap the old deed resting inside his desk drawer and smile. People can make claims all day long, he would tell me. The courthouse only believes the ones supported by records. At the time, I thought he was talking only about legal paperwork. Standing on that porch years later, I finally understood what he really meant. Paperwork protects ownership, but patience protects the opportunity to let that paperwork matter. I walked back inside and slowly looked through every room once again. Nothing had been damaged. Nothing had been stolen. Yet everything somehow felt different because I now knew how many people had unknowingly walked through those rooms believing someone else had the authority to welcome them. Karen could create polished advertisements, glowing reviews, beautiful photographs, and convincing stories. She could persuade strangers that she managed an entire collection of cabins. But if there were other properties involved, then my family's cabin might not be the only one waiting for the truth to catch up with it. That possibility stayed with me all morning, and before leaving for town, I folded one more empty evidence folder into my briefcase because I had a feeling the story was about to become much larger than a single cabin by the lake. Early Monday morning, I loaded 2 thick folders into my truck and drove into town. One contained everything I had gathered over the weekend, including archived screenshots, reservation confirmations, payment receipts, smart lock logs, security camera timestamps, and every page from the notebook I had carefully organized. The second folder contained something my father always considered even more important than evidence collected after a problem appeared. It held the original deed, certified survey maps, decades of property tax records, insurance policies, utility statements, and every legal document tracing Cedar Hollow Cabin from my parents to me. He always believed the best time to organize paperwork was years before anyone ever needed it. My destination was a small brick office overlooking the county courthouse where Clara Bennett had practiced real estate law for more than 30 years. Around our county, people often joke that if Clara could not untangle a property dispute, the disagreement probably belonged in a history book instead of a courtroom. She greeted me warmly, but her expression changed the moment she saw the folders under my arm. "That looks like more than a boundary disagreement," she said. "I think it became more than that several months ago," I replied. She invited me into her conference room, spread every document across the table, and spent nearly 40 minutes reading without interruption. She examined the Airbnb listing, archived screenshots, reservation history, guest messages, payment confirmations, security camera images, smart lock access logs, and every handwritten note I had organized by date. Occasionally, she placed a colored tab on a page or highlighted a sentence, but she never interrupted the timeline. When she reached the final document, she folded her hands and looked directly at me. "Daniel," she said quietly, "this is not simply someone using your property without permission. This appears to be an ongoing commercial operation built around property they never owned." Hearing those words changed the way I viewed everything. Until that moment, I had been thinking like a homeowner dealing with trespassing. Clara was looking at the larger pattern. Every reservation generated income. Every guest message documented another transaction. Every review encouraged future bookings. Every public response reinforced Karen's claim that she managed the property. It was not one poor decision repeated many times. It was a business model. Then Clara paused on one page inside my notebook. "Tell me about this phrase," she said, pointing to the words "our collection of premium lake properties." I explained how I kept seeing it repeated beneath guest reviews. Clara leaned back thoughtfully. "That may become important," she said. "Either it is exaggerated marketing or someone is representing additional properties the same way. We cannot assume either one yet, but we should not ignore it." She wrote a separate note and placed it in a new folder labeled Additional Properties. That single folder immediately caught my attention because it suggested the story might extend beyond my cabin. She then asked the question I had expected from the beginning. "Have you contacted Karen?" "No," I answered. Clara smiled slightly. "Good. The quickest way to weaken a case is to warn someone before they finish documenting it themselves." She divided everything into organized sections. Ownership records went into one folder, reservation documents into another, security footage and electronic access logs into a third, guest communications into a fourth. Finally, she asked me to reopen the Airbnb listing on my phone. Together, we reviewed every detail again, including nightly rates, cleaning fees, cancellation policies, occupancy limits, automated welcome messages, and every public response Karen had written beneath guest reviews. Everything carried timestamps. Everything documented another decision. Clara pointed toward the earliest reviews. "Do not focus on what the guests wrote," she said. "Focus on how long this has been happening." I looked more closely. The oldest reviews stretched back almost 5 months. Families described autumn fishing trips, Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas mornings, and spring weekends beside the lake. Karen had not built this operation in a few weeks. She had quietly expanded it over an entire season. Before I left, Clara handed me a single sheet of paper with 5 instructions written neatly across the top. "Do not contact Airbnb. Do not confront Karen. Do not change the electronic lock. Preserve every active record exactly as it exists today. And if you notice anything connecting another property to this operation, document it before doing anything else." I looked at the list before asking the obvious question. "You think there could be other owners?" Clara closed the folder, marked additional properties. I think we should let the evidence answer that question. As I stepped outside, my phone vibrated with another Airbnb notification. Karen had just accepted a new reservation for the coming weekend. Moments later, she publicly thanked the guests for choosing one of our favorite lake retreats and promised to welcome them personally. I stared at those words for several seconds. If that message was only advertising, it was careless. If it was true, then my family's cabin was not the only property at the center of this story. The next several days unfolded with almost perfect routine, and that routine told me something important. Karen had absolutely no idea anyone was watching. Every morning, I checked the reservation calendar before making coffee, and every evening I reviewed the newest footage from the exterior security cameras. Nothing about the operation changed. On Wednesday morning, Karen arrived shortly after 9 o'clock in the same dark gray sport utility vehicle I had seen so many times in the recordings. 2 assistants climbed out behind her carrying fresh bed linens, grocery bags, flowers, and several storage bins filled with cleaning supplies. They moved with the confidence of people following a system they had repeated dozens of times. One assistant swept the porch while the other carried clean towels into the bedrooms. Karen walked slowly through every room holding a tablet computer, stopping every few minutes to compare what she saw with a digital checklist before tapping another item complete. From the camera overlooking the driveway, I watched her straighten framed photographs, arrange pillows on the sofa, refill the welcome basket on the kitchen counter, and replace fresh flowers beside Emily's old recipe box. She treated my family's cabin exactly the way a hotel manager would prepare a luxury suite before new guests arrived. Watching someone move so comfortably through a place filled with my family's memories was unsettling, but it also confirmed something Clara had already suspected. Karen no longer behaved like someone borrowing another person's property. She behaved like someone convinced she owned the operation. I remained nearly half a mile away on an old logging road overlooking the cabin through the binoculars I normally used for birdwatching. More than once I thought about driving down the hill and asking the one question that refused to leave my mind. Why? Why would someone who already held a respected position inside the community risk everything for property that obviously belonged to someone else? Every time I considered confronting her, I remembered Clara's advice. Evidence grows strongest when people believe nobody is paying attention. Shortly after noon, another notification appeared on my phone. The Airbnb listing had just been updated again. I opened the page and immediately recognized several new photographs. Fresh flowers rested on the dining table. Clean towels had been folded neatly across the guest bed. Afternoon sunlight reflected across the lake from the end of my dock. Karen had uploaded photographs taken only minutes earlier inside my cabin. Beneath them, she welcomed another family and thanked them for choosing one of our signature lake retreats. I paused. The wording had changed again. Earlier, she referred to a collection of premium lake properties. Now she described my cabin as one of our signature retreats. Curious, I searched her public profile instead of the individual listing. What I found immediately caught my attention. Her host profile displayed dozens of glowing reviews, but only one active property remained visible. The review count was far too high for a single cabin. That meant other listings had existed before or had recently been removed from public view. I quickly captured screenshots of everything before anything could change. Then I noticed another recent public response beneath a guest review. Karen thanked a returning family for visiting another one of our lake homes the previous autumn, and said she hoped they would continue exploring the rest of the collection in the future. I read the sentence twice. It was the first time she openly suggested repeat guests had stayed at multiple properties connected to the same operation. I immediately forwarded the screenshots to Clara. Less than 10 minutes later, my phone rang. "Do not assume anything yet," she said calmly, "but preserve every one of those screenshots. If additional listings existed, we need to know whether they belong to willing owners or whether someone else is about to discover exactly what you discovered." Before ending the call, Clara told me something she had quietly arranged that morning. The sheriff's office had already reviewed the ownership records, the smart lock logs, the reservation history, and the timeline we assembled. The deputies understood that the arriving guests were innocent and that our goal remained exactly the same. Protect the guests. Protect the evidence. Let the documents answer every question. As the afternoon sun settled lower across the lake, Karen and her assistants finished preparing the cabin, loaded the empty storage bins into their vehicle, and drove away. Less than 30 minutes later, another message appeared through the reservation system. The family arriving on Friday thanked Karen for recommending a scenic route through the Ozarks and said they expected to arrive just before sunset. Karen replied almost immediately. She wished them a safe trip, reminded them that their electronic access code would activate upon arrival, and ended her message with a sentence that made me close my phone for a moment. "I cannot wait to welcome you back to our favorite cabin on the lake." Back. That single word stood out more than anything else she had written. Either those guests had stayed there before, or Karen had become so comfortable with her own story that she no longer noticed the details. Either possibility worked in our favor. She still believed another ordinary weekend was about to begin. She had no idea that by the time her next guests reached the cabin, every word she had written would already be waiting for her. Friday afternoon arrived exactly when the reservation calendar said it would. The sky was clear, the lake was calm, and Cedar Hollow Cabin looked exactly the way it had in Karen's newest photographs. From a distance, everything appeared perfect. That was the illusion she had spent months creating. At 3:14 in the afternoon, my phone vibrated with a smart lock notification. The temporary access code had just been activated. Seconds later, the front gate camera showed a full-size pickup truck towing a fishing boat turning slowly onto my private gravel road. Behind it came another sport utility vehicle loaded with bicycles, coolers, folding chairs, and two excited children pointing toward the water. According to the reservation confirmation Clara had preserved earlier that week, they had driven nearly 400 miles for this vacation. Watching them arrive reminded me once again that they were never the people I was trying to stop. They were simply another family trusting information that appeared completely legitimate. From a wooded overlook nearly half a mile away, I watched through my binoculars as everyone climbed out smiling. One couple stopped to take photographs before unloading a single bag. The children raced toward the porch while their grandparents admired the lake. Emily would have loved seeing a family making memories there. What she never would have imagined was someone selling those memories as though they belonged to her. Less than 10 minutes after the guests arrived, Karen's familiar dark gray sport utility vehicle rolled into the driveway. She stepped out carrying a wicker basket filled with locally roasted coffee, homemade preserves, fresh pastries, and brochures highlighting nearby hiking trails and fishing spots. She greeted every member of the family by name before they even introduced themselves. She shook hands with the parents, knelt to greet the children, and pointed toward the dock while recommending the best place to watch the sunset. If I had not known the truth, I probably would have believed she owned the property herself. Confidence has a remarkable way of making borrowed authority look genuine. One of the fathers thanked her for answering every question before the trip. Karen smiled warmly and said she wanted every guest to feel at home from the moment they arrived. Another guest complimented the photographs on the listing, saying the cabin looked even better in person. Karen accepted the compliment naturally before explaining where extra blankets were stored and reminding everyone to lock the front door before bedtime. Every sentence she spoke reinforced the image she had spent months creating. Then the same young boy carrying a fishing rod looked up at her and asked, "Did your family build this cabin?" Karen smiled without the slightest pause. "Yes," she answered. "We have taken care of this place for generations. It has always been one of our favorite family properties." I slowly lowered my binoculars. That statement was different from anything she had written online. It was no longer polished advertising. It was a direct claim made in front of witnesses. I quietly wrote the time into my notebook. 6:26 in the evening. Only a minute later, my phone rang. It was Clara. "The deputies are 5 minutes away," she said calmly. "Do not approach the property yet." "Understood," I replied. She paused before adding one final instruction. "Wait until she finishes introducing herself as the owner. Let every statement come from her. The strongest evidence is always volunteered." I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked toward the cabin again. Karen was now standing on the porch answering another question from one of the guests. "How many cabins do you manage?" the man asked casually. Karen laughed. "We have been expanding every year," she replied. "People keep coming back because they know they can trust us." She had just repeated the same story she had been telling online. Only this time she said it in front of multiple independent witnesses. Clara had been right. There was no reason to interrupt her. Every confident answer only made the timeline stronger. Then my phone vibrated one final time. A simple message appeared from Clara. They just turned onto your road. I looked toward the entrance to my property. Two county sport utility vehicles had just appeared beyond the trees, moving slowly toward the cabin without lights or sirens. Karen was still smiling, still welcoming guests, and still completely convinced another profitable weekend had just begun. She had no idea that within the next few minutes, every story she had spent months telling would be measured against the only story that had ever mattered, the one already recorded at the county courthouse. The first county sport utility vehicle rolled slowly through the entrance without flashing lights or a siren. A second vehicle followed a few moments later, stopping several yards behind the first. Their arrival was calm, professional, and almost quiet enough to go unnoticed if everyone had not already been standing outside. The families paused in the middle of unloading coolers and folding chairs, exchanging curious glances as two deputies stepped onto the gravel driveway. Karen looked toward the vehicles with a brief flicker of surprise before replacing it with the same confident smile she had worn all afternoon. She walked forward as though she expected nothing more than a routine conversation. I remained several steps behind the deputies as they approached the porch. One of them greeted everyone politely before speaking in an even voice. Good evening. Before anyone continues checking into this property, we need to verify who has the legal authority to lease it. Karen answered almost immediately. Officer, there must be some misunderstanding, she said with complete confidence. I am the property manager for Pine Ridge Estates Vacation Rentals. Everything here has already been arranged. The deputy nodded courteously. Do you own this property? Karen smiled as though the answer should have been obvious. Ownership is not really the issue, she replied. The Homeowners Association manages properties throughout this area. The deputy remained perfectly calm. Today, ownership is exactly the issue. Do you own this parcel? Karen hesitated for the first time before answering. The association has overseen this cabin for quite a while. That was not my question, the deputy replied. Do you own it? Karen's smile tightened slightly. No, but I have authority to manage it. Can you show me where the owner granted you that authority? The deputy asked. Karen immediately opened the leather portfolio she had been carrying all afternoon. She confidently removed reservation confirmations, guest welcome packets, cleaning schedules, printed calendars, payment summaries, and copies of upcoming bookings before handing them over. The deputy reviewed every page carefully and then returned the stack. These documents confirm reservations, he said calmly. They do not establish legal authority to lease private property. Karen drew a slow breath. The Homeowners Association has always handled cabins like this. Can you provide a signed management agreement? The deputy asked. Karen looked back into the portfolio. Not with me. Can you provide one electronically? I would have to check. Can you identify the document where the owner authorized you to rent this cabin? For the first time all afternoon, Karen did not answer immediately. She turned page after page inside the portfolio. Reservation confirmations, cleaning schedules, guest correspondence, marketing brochures, house rules, beautifully organized paperwork, but nothing connecting her to the legal owner. At that moment, I stepped forward and handed the deputy the binder Clara and I had prepared. Inside were certified copies of the recorded deed, survey maps, property tax records, insurance documents, utility statements, and every transfer document tracing Cedar Hollow cabin from my parents to me. A second deputy compared the parcel number printed on the deed with the information displayed on a secured county tablet. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. Even the children stood quietly beside their parents while official records were reviewed one page at a time. After several minutes, the second deputy looked up. County records confirm continuous ownership by Mr. Daniel Harper. He announced clearly enough for everyone gathered on the porch to hear. There is no recorded agreement granting leasing authority, management authority, operational control, or agency authority to Pine Ridge Estates, the Homeowners Association, or any representative acting on its behalf. Silence settled across the driveway. One father slowly lowered the welcome packet Karen had handed him only minutes earlier. Another guest quietly looked from Karen to me and then back to the certified deed resting on the porch table. Karen tried once more. The association has always understood that this cabin was part of our community program, she insisted. The deputy nodded politely. An understanding is not the same as authorization. Do you have any documents signed by the owner? Karen searched through the portfolio again, this time far less confidently. Not at the moment. Do you have any recorded agreement filed with the county? No. Do you have any written authorization from Mr. Harper? Karen looked toward me for the first time since the deputies arrived. She did not answer. Just then Clara walked up carrying another file box and placed several organized folders beside the deed. Inside were archived copies of the Airbnb listing, reservation histories, guest communications, payment confirmations, smart lock access logs, security camera images, and screenshots documenting every public response Karen had posted over the previous several months, including the messages describing my cabin as one of our signature lake retreats and part of our collection of premium lake properties. One deputy quietly compared the timestamps from the smart lock with the reservation calendar, while another reviewed the photographs showing Karen preparing the cabin before every guest arrival. Every record matched the next one. One of the fathers looked at Karen in complete disbelief. "You told us your family had owned this place for generations," he said softly. Karen opened her mouth to answer, but stopped before a single word came out. Nobody else spoke either. The only sounds were the wind moving through the cedar trees and the pages of the certified deed resting quietly on the porch table. In that moment, every polished advertisement, every glowing review, every confident welcome message, and every story Karen had spent months creating carried less weight than a single recorded document filed years earlier at the county courthouse. And for the first time since this entire ordeal began, it was no longer my word against hers. It was simply the truth standing beside the paperwork that had been waiting there all along. The deputies remained at the cabin long after the questions had been answered because there was still important work to complete. They spoke privately with each family, carefully explaining that the reservations had been arranged by someone who had never possessed verified legal authority to lease the property. Every guest was assured they had acted in good faith by relying on information presented through a trusted booking platform. Clara helped each family organize copies of reservation confirmations, payment receipts, and message histories so they could begin requesting refunds. Nobody argued. Nobody blamed anyone else. Most of them simply looked disappointed that a vacation they had planned for months had begun with confusion instead of the peaceful weekend they expected. Before leaving, the father who had first greeted me walked over and held out his hand. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "We believed every word because everything looked legitimate." I shook his hand and smiled. "You trusted the information you were given," I replied. "That is what reasonable people are supposed to do." As the last family drove away, the driveway became quiet again. The deputies completed their reports, documented the certified ownership records they had verified, and collected copies of the evidence Clara had carefully organized. Before leaving, one deputy looked toward Karen one final time. "If anyone asks who owns this property," he said calmly, "the answer has already been recorded for years." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The statement carried more weight than any argument ever could. During the following week, the Airbnb listing disappeared completely. Every photograph of my porch, my dock, my fireplace, Emily's flower garden, and my family's dining table vanished from the website. The reservation calendar showed no future bookings. The profile that had proudly displayed dozens of glowing reviews no longer advertised Cedar Hollow Cabin. 2 days later, I received a brief notification from Airbnb confirming that the listing associated with my property had been removed following a review of the ownership documentation that had been provided. It was only a few sentences long, but it marked the quiet end of a story Karen had spent months trying to write. Clara later reminded me that preserving archived copies before anything disappeared had been one of the smartest decisions we made because digital evidence can vanish overnight, while recorded county documents remain exactly where they belong. I spent the next several days replacing every electronic access code, installing a new smart lock, updating the security system, and changing every physical key connected to the cabin. Those changes were not driven by anger. They were simply part of protecting a home my family had spent nearly half a century building. Around the lake, people naturally began asking why the steady stream of vacation guests had suddenly stopped. I never felt the need to explain the entire story. The truth had already spoken through the documents, and in a small community, official records usually travel farther than rumors. Several neighbors quietly stopped by over the next few weeks. More than one admitted they had seen unfamiliar vehicles, coming and going for months, but assumed everything was legitimate because Karen always acted with complete confidence. One older neighbor looked across the lake before smiling to himself. "Confidence can look a lot like ownership," he said, "right up until somebody asks for the paperwork." I never forgot that sentence because it explained the entire experience better than I ever could. About a month later, an envelope arrived in my mailbox without a return address. Inside was a handwritten note from the father who had unknowingly rented the cabin. He thanked me for treating his family with kindness during an embarrassing situation, apologized once again for something that had never truly been his fault, and enclosed a photograph his young daughter had taken of the sunset before they left that evening. On the back she had written, "I hope the real owner gets to watch this every summer." I stood there holding that photograph much longer than I expected. Then I placed it inside the same drawer where Emily kept her handwritten recipe cards because, in its own way, it had become part of the cabin's story too. A few evenings later, I carried my father's old fishing rod down to the dock just before sunset. The water reflected the orange sky exactly the way it had when I was a boy sitting beside him on those same weathered boards. Emily's wildflowers still lined the front walk. The porch swing still faced the lake because I finally understood why she never wanted it anywhere else. Standing there, I realized the greatest thing I recovered had nothing to do with canceled reservations or lost rental income. I recovered the quiet certainty that every memory inside that cabin remained exactly where it belonged. My parents built that home one paycheck at a time. Emily filled it with warmth no advertisement could ever reproduce. My responsibility had never been to win an argument. It had simply been to protect the place they trusted me to preserve. Looking back now, I often remember something my father said every time he placed another property document into his old filing cabinet. "People can tell any story they want," he would say. "The courthouse only remembers the truth." At the time, I thought he was talking about paperwork. Now I understand he was talking about patience, honesty, and the quiet confidence that comes from never needing to pretend something is yours when it already is. Karen spent months building an impressive business around a story she invented. My family spent nearly 50 years building a life around the truth. When those two stories were finally measured against each other, only one of them had ever been supported by the records, and in the end, those records quietly spoke for everyone who no longer needed to say another word.